couple of weeks. Wanted to make sure we touched base and got in the Word of God together and encouraged one another. So I'm going to be reading from Mark 5, beginning at verse 25. Here's what it says. It says, "A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse." So this story of this woman is that she is in desperate need. She has a desperate ailment. And if you can think about it, like the ailment has been going on for 12 years. And I don't know about you, but one time I scratched my eye, my cornea in high school, and it was irritating, it was annoying, it was painful, and it was about 7 to 10 days, and it was almost debilitating. It was humiliating. I had to wear an eye patch and put ointment in my eye, and it was awful, but it was only 10 days. This woman had been dealing with the constant, Mark says, it's a constant bleeding. She'd been dealing with this constant ailment for 12 years. That'd be like you contracting it at age 6, which is roughly when you're in kindergarten, and you having it day in and day out, moment by moment, from kindergarten all the way till you're a senior in high school. And see, the issue with her ailment in that culture was that this constant discharge of blood that was going on in her story meant that it didn't only affect her physically, but it affected her emotionally and spiritually as well, because of the law of the land that God had put into place under Moses, that someone with her condition would be considered unclean. And that if somebody in her immediate family or even out in public, if they would brush up against her, touch something she touched, they themselves would be considered unclean. We find that in Leviticus 15, beginning at verse 25. It says, "If a woman has a flow of blood for many days, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she is ceremoniously unclean. Any bed she lies on and any object she sits on at that time will be unclean. If any of you touch anything that she has touched, you will be ceremonially unclean. You must," this is the deal, this is what happens if you were even to brush up against her, "you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening." So this lady was not just dealing with an ailment that was physically degrading, but it was emotionally degrading. It was humiliating. It was shameful. It separated her. It caused her to be an outcast and on the outskirts. And anytime she went out into public, she would have to address and let people know that she was unclean. She couldn't hide it. She couldn't mask it away. If somebody found out, then they would be angry and have to go through this process of washing themselves and bathing themselves and separating themselves. So she was only able to really associate with anybody else who was unclean. And she had been dealing with this for 12 years. Can you imagine the hopelessness, the disillusionment, the confusion, and the anger and the frustration that was welling up in her, as she couldn't be near her family, she couldn't be near her friends, and also because of the law, she couldn't even go to worship. There was no safe community for her to be a part of. She was all alone and rejected. And not only that, but it says in the scriptures here that she had been suffering for 12 years and it was constant bleeding, but she had suffered a great deal from many doctors. That she had attempted to solve the problem on her own. She had put herself under the care and under the wisdom and under the scheming of those who possibly could heal her, and they had failed. All the attempts that they had put together were no good. They couldn't solve the issue. And not only had she spent everything she had to pay them. So all the material things that she once had, she got rid of all of her material possessions. She sold it all in order to try to get better. But all of the human power, all of the human wisdom, all of her striving, and all of her effort had left her with nothing to show. The scriptures say that she hadn't gotten any better. And not only had she not gotten better, in fact, the scriptures say she had gotten worse. She had spent everything she had. She had put all of her hope in the best that humanity had to offer, and it had only left her wanting and unsatisfied. And I think that's a lot of our stories. There's a lot of times we believe that things in this world are sin, the glitz, the glam, the things that promise satisfaction in our life. We go after them, we sell ourselves to them, we put ourselves in their presence, but they only leave us empty, bankrupt, and disillusioned. And that's where this woman was until verse 27 says she heard about Jesus. The story of Jesus intersected this woman at the exact place where her human effort and the power of humanity around her had failed her. She had tried to save herself, but all those efforts, all that striving had fallen flat, and now the story of Jesus comes to her. She had heard about Jesus. She had heard that Jesus opens blind eyes. She had heard that the lame walk and leap. She had heard that those who had been born without speech are now declaring the wonders of God. She had heard that He multiplied bread and fed those who were needy. She had heard that He doesn't shy away from the unrighteous and from the sinners of that time, but He makes room for them and He welcomes them, even inviting tax collectors into His inner circle. She had heard that He touches the leper. And you got to understand, for someone who was unclean for the past 12 years, to know that this person, Jesus, would put Himself next to someone who was unclean and who would touch them. Would Jesus really become an outcast so that I could be accepted? Would Jesus really align Himself with my shame so I could walk with my head held high? Would Jesus really risk the possibility of not being able to go into the temple and worship so that I could go to worship God freely? Would Jesus really become unclean so that I could become clean? She had heard of Jesus. And what does she do? Well, she moves out to where Jesus was. She moves out in faith. Every other avenue I have tried has left me with nothing. It has only taken from me, and I've gotten worse. But I believe that Jesus has a power unlike any other power that the world has to offer. And so if I could just get into His presence, then I will be healed. Listen to what she tells herself in verse 28. For she thought to herself, this is faith. If I can just touch His robe, if I can just get near Him, if I can get around Him, if I can just get to the fringe, that's just all I need. He's so powerful. He is who He claims He is. If I can just get into His presence, He doesn't need to talk to me. He doesn't need to look at me. He doesn't need to speak with me. If I can just touch an article of His clothing, then listen to the certainty. I will be healed. This woman had such strong faith. Against all odds, against all of the hopelessness, she hoped in the mercy and in the power and in the life of Jesus for her. I will be healed. I know I've gotten worse. I know it doesn't look like it's going to be any better. I've spent everything I had, but Jesus is the treasure that I need in my life. He is the rescuer. He's my redeemer, and He can restore what no other person, not even myself, can restore. I will be healed if I am in His presence. And in verse 30, we realize that it's not so much that this woman's heart is set on Jesus, but it's actually that Jesus' heart is set on her, that her healing comes. She just needed to admit her inability and her weakness, but Jesus knows her. And it's not her activity that heals her. It's that Jesus knew her malady and took joy in healing it. Look at verse 30. It says, Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? You see, his disciples said to him, look at all these people. How can you ask who touched me? But look at this. He kept on looking around to see who had done it. You see, he knew her. His heart was set on her. It wasn't that she had to have her heart so set on him, because our hearts are going to waver. Our hearts are going to be up. Our hearts are going to be down. We can't be flawless, but he can be flawless. And so he turned and he wanted to acknowledge her. My heart is set on you. That's why you are healed. You moved. You trusted that I wouldn't reject you and that I would find you and I would restore you and heal you. But my heart is set on you. And then she comes and she goes and confesses this is what happened. And listen to Jesus' words to her. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. Two things she has not had in 12 years. Peace and healing, restoration. She is now at peace. No more anxious thoughts. No more despair. She is accepted. She is known. She is beautiful and loved as she is. And because she is loved, she is restored. I want to read this quote to you as we end our time with this passage. And I think it's a beautiful quote and an assurance that we can take. And here's what it says. Paul reminds us that the gospel shows we don't need to make ourselves beautiful or lovable to God. She shows up with the reality of her suffering. She shows up in the ugliness of her malady and of the constant ailment. That's how she comes. So the gospel shows us we don't need to make ourselves beautiful or lovable to God. He already knows us. He's looking around at the crowd. He knows who touched him. He knows who she is. If this is the case, we don't need to make an idol out of other people's approval or even out of our own self-approval, because we are loved as we are and given Christ's perfect righteousness, obedience, and perfect belonging with the Father. Can we come around that one more time, that this is true, that this woman comes as she is. She doesn't try to dress herself up. She doesn't try to be more than she already is. What makes a person a Christian is not so much your knowing God, but his knowing of you. That's what makes you his daughter or his son. I know you by name and you're mine, and I went to the cross to be broken. And I felt the rejection that was yours so that you could be healed and restored and at peace, and that your suffering would be over. Would you know today the love of Jesus, who knows you by name, who protects his sheep, who dies for them so that they might be healed, at peace, and that suffering would be over?